Hello and welcome to Breaking Bread with Rivaj Maharaj, where nothing is off the table. For today's episode, I wanted to talk about the United Kingdom agreeing to bolster its troop force numbers in Norway to help counter the Russian threat. So without further ado, let's get into it. The United Kingdom has now pledged to bolster the number of UK troops in Norway to help counter the Russian threat. Now, this means that I think we've got something like 1,000. Yes, we've got Defense Secretary John Healey said the number of British troops stationed in Norway will increase from 1,000 to 2,000 personnel. You know, as you go through this article, you find that they mention, for example, the Russian threat to the UK and Norway has increased in the last 2 years with the threat to the undersea cables being a priority. So the United Kingdom together with Norway will then increase their patrols in the region to solidify the protection of these cables, for instance. And that's just one of the issues. However, let's look at what has happened to cause this dynamic to shift, where they've noticed a change in the last 2 years. So let's look at the timeline. 4 years ago, the Russians launched a special military operation into Ukraine. Prior to that, you had European expansion, NATO expansion, up to Russia's doorstep. Now, again, I'm not saying the Russians are right, the Ukrainians are wrong, or vice versa. I've got no skin in this game. It doesn't matter to me one way or another. I think that the politicians that we elect are generally a bunch of morons who are, they are psychopaths, they are narcissistic, and they have zero empathy for their people. So I'm just giving you my take on what I think is happening, because these sickos are still going to do whatever they feel. The Russians feel from their side that there is an existential threat to their sovereignty and to their way of life. If you look at Europe, Western Europe in particular, over the last 10, 15 years, you've seen a lot of policies being promulgated and implemented that are in direct contradiction with the founding values of European society, whether it's Eastern European or Western European. Russia is an deeply Christian society. The religion of Orthodox Christianity, the strong family values, they are what form the underpinnings of Russian society. Now, when they look outward and they see what has happened subsequently in Western Europe, they understand that this is something they don't want to infect and infest their society. So, this is one of the reasons why they see this NATO expansion towards Russia as an existential threat. Now again, what we think of it and what our aims are, or what our politicians' aims are immaterial. It's the way the Russians look at it. And that's important. It's always important to put your foot into somebody else's shoe to understand what it is that they are seeing, feeling, and experiencing in order to understand why they object or acquiesce with what is happening to them. And in this case, they object because they simply see NATO expansion as a threat to their way of life. Now, we find that unimaginable. When the Russians launched a special military operation, the first thing that everybody went on saying was that, does Ukraine not have a right to its sovereignty? Does Ukraine not have the right to decide where it wants to pivot to? Of course it does. But were those same arguments held when the Cubans requested Russian missiles be deployed to Cuba? Somehow in this debate or in this argument that the Ukrainians have a right of sovereignty, the Cuban, the Bay of Pigs incident, the Cuban Missile Crisis doesn't feature. So we don't like it when it's done to us, but we expect other people to just sit back and embrace it when we do it to them. So this kind of logic doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense. Because if we feel that the Russians putting a stop to NATO expansion into Ukraine is something that is immoral, then what we do in the Middle East is immoral. What we do in Africa is immoral. We've gone and changed governments in Libya. Look at Libya. Libya is a basket case. It's a disaster zone. We've gone and turned a country that had the highest education rate per capita in Africa. People in Libya had higher education standards than anywhere else in Africa. And we've turned it into a society where you can now go and buy a slave, a human being at a market. But we want to stand on this moral pedestal, on this shoebox, and tell the Russians that what they are doing is wrong. What they are doing indeed may be wrong. But what moral right do we have to stand on, given our past and our current policies? Keir Starmer wants to go and fight for the Ukrainians. 250,000 young white British vulnerable girls were being raped, trafficked and murdered by Pakistani grooming gangs. I don't see him taking the lead charge in that. He had every ample opportunity to do so. I don't see British politicians standing there and championing the cause of those poor kids that were abused. God forbid it happens to their kids. But there's an us and them. So we want to have this moral fortitude to go out there and preach to the world when, forget about what we did in the past. What we're currently doing is a disgrace. We want to send 1,000 more troops to Norway. I don't know what that is going to do. Furthermore, the threat to Western European society, sovereignty, has come from the United States. When Donald Trump said he'll take Greenland one way or another, or is that something we've all just conveniently forgotten? And the Greenland issue is not off the table. It is certainly not off the table. I said it before and I'll say it again. Donald Trump will have Greenland one way or another. And there is sweet nothing that Western Europe can do about it, including NATO. And this is why you find Mark Rutte on this appeasement campaign. Oh, daddy this and all this nonsense. Because number one, he'll be out of a job. And number two, they have nothing to put up against the Americans. The Americans land in Greenland. What on earth can they do but stand and watch? Give them a flag. Let them wave a flag and say, come as liberators. Because that's about the only thing you can do. We can't protect our borders against illegal immigration. We want to go and protect the Norwegians. This comes down to the policy of you always need a boogeyman. As long as these European governments have the boogeyman, and that is Russia. And listen, I'm not saying the Russians government or, Vladimir Putin, they're angels. Or I'm just saying, you can sit down, have dialogue. The one thing that occurred during the Ukrainian debacle was that we cut off all diplomacy with the Russians. We refused to talk to them. We refused to acknowledge them, almost behaving like kids in a preschool, And this is not how diplomacy works. This is not how nation states deal with each other. So we force their hand. We get them to go into Ukraine. They go into Ukraine. We use it against them. And we then tell our public that we get our PR companies to go into overdrive and the spin starts coming out and the public, gullible as ever, just swallow wholeheartedly verbatim any bullshit that the government sends out. And they go along with this policy, not sitting back and thinking, hang on, let's see what is happening, because the truth lies somewhere in between. Now, 4 years into the war, we've noticed a threat 2 years ago. Why? Because we antagonized them in the first place. So they are naturally, let's look at it from the Russian point of view. They are doing that because we have antagonized them and because we're probably doing the same thing to them. So they are acting preemptively. But once again, it plays into our narrative. We rally the public against us. Putin is this bad man. The Russians are nasty people and they're going to come and take over. Why the hell would the Russians want to take over Britain? Tell me. We don't need the Russians to come in and break our society and reduce us to a joke. We're well capable of doing that for ourselves. If you look at where the United Kingdom is today and the leadership it's under, we have no problems doing that to ourselves. The problem is, rather than saying we did it to ourselves, we need a boogeyman to blame. And this victimhood needs to stop. We need to stop embracing this victimhood. How we went from a country that was known for innovation, engineering prowess, the capabilities that the world looked up to where we are now reduced to a laughingstock. I don't know. I really don't know. It baffles me. But I'm saying if we were able to be in that position once upon a time, we certainly have it within us to get back there. Rather than finding boogeymen all over the place and blaming everybody else for our incapabilities and insecurities, let's grab the bull by the horns. Let's develop our societies and let's become the best of what we can, rather than the joke that we're currently embracing. And that starts by getting proper politicians into power, not clowns and jokers who jump on a plane every opportunity they can to go and have a bloody holiday, or according to the Epstein files, threesomes here, there and everywhere, and engage in pedophilia and the like. That's not what we need. That's not what we are. Just going through this article, you see that over the last 4 years, a general ramping up, a general escalation towards an inevitable war with Russia. Europe is on course to go to war with Russia. The question the Europeans need to ask themselves is, when that day arrives, will the United States be with us, be against us, or just sit back and watch? Because I'll tell you, with all this defense money being spent and increase in defense, the United States are quite happy. It's a replay of this prior to the Second World War. Their economy will boom because they will supply us with weapons and they will supply us with everything that is required to go to war. So I want to thank you for spending time with us, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Please remember to like, share and subscribe, as it helps us with the algorithm and it helps our channel to grow.